Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gallagher's Own Your Growth Women's Leadership Series webinar. I am Nicole, and I will be your host for today's conversation. But before we start, I wanted to share just a few housekeeping items. So this webcast is in listen-only mode. And if you happen to lose audio or you don't see the slides advancing, you can just simply refresh your browser and it'll pop back up. And if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please use the Q&A box that you see on your screen. If we don't get to your specific question, a Gallagher contact will be in touch with you to follow up. We also have SHRM and HRCI credits that will be available here in the webcast console, and it'll also be in the post-event email alongside with a recording of today's session and a PDF of today's slides. All right, so let's get started and discuss the power of generational diversity in the workplace. With that, I'd like to welcome our incredible panel of women, and I'll ask that they each introduce themselves and help the audience gain an understanding of their experience in managing or being a part of a generationally diverse team, and possibly how their perceptions of how this has evolved throughout their career. So Maruchi, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Maruchi Cantu. I am the Executive Vice President for Administration at DFW Airport and have had the great privilege over the years of working for various large organizations. I share that because it plays into kind of my perception and how it's been formed of generational diversity over the years. Like all of you, I started my career. I did start my career relatively young. I was working while I was going to college, and I started in human resources. I worked for varying companies that are Fortune 500, Fortune 50, and realized early on in my career, I was that new generation. And I personally experienced some things that were just a little bit of a shock to me coming into a workplace that was largely male and largely at the time a baby boomer. And here I was coming in as Gen X, and I had a very different way of looking at things. And so I was treated a bit differently. I actually remember I had worked my way through school and had a lot of great experience that I felt I could share with the organization. And I had my first leader really, truly make me feel like I was fresh out of school with absolutely no experience. So it was an eye-opener for me that, I think being sensitive to what the new generation coming in is bringing to the table was incredibly important, and that we valued them and helped them feel valued by the organization. It was funny though, like, everyone, there's a time when the table shifts and you're the person on the other side. And quite frankly, there was a point I was working at Frito that I realized the generation we were bringing in was where I had been 10, 15 years ago. And so I think it's rung true to me from the beginning of my career and still holds very true to me today that every single person, for varying reasons of diversity, brings something very unique to the table. And I think it's our role to harness that, to bring awareness to it, to be able to make sure that every employee, regardless of their generation or any other differences, is bringing their whole self and bringing their best to work.
I love that. I'll go next. So my name's Katie Lopez-Ladd. I'm the global lead for talent and culture at Hatch. And I would say I relate to this topic on a few different levels. So from a personal perspective, I've often been in my career, a position in my career where I'm both leading individuals that are both younger and older than me. I've also been in a lot of situations where I've had clients who are significantly older than me as well. On top of that, I've also, similar to Maruchi, worked in a lot of more industrial organizations. So sometimes I've found myself be the only woman in the room or nearly the only woman in the room. And, as I've been coming up in my career, I would say that's definitely led to some moments of, some imposter syndrome for me. What the heck do I have to say that these people should be listening to? And so I think I've definitely battled with that throughout my career. And I think it's so important to have these types of open conversations and to really be transparent and vulnerable about supporting women throughout all stages of their careers. fortunately, I've had some really amazing mentors in my career who have, kind of given me that push to just go for it when I was doubting myself a little bit. And I think that's really made such a difference for me. And then from more of a professional perspective, I consider myself very lucky to work in a very diverse environment. We have a lot of colleagues who are, more recent graduates starting with the organization, but also individuals who have been with the organization for 20, 30, even 40 years. And so for my team, it's really our responsibility and our hope that people have meaningful careers, no matter their experience level, no matter where they're at in their careers. So I'm really excited about this conversation today to talk about, yes, some of the challenges of making that happen, but also all the amazing opportunities that presents and the amazing things that can come out of really having diverse perspectives in the workplace.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cassandra Rose, and I feel so fortunate to be on a panel with very strong women. I am an HR executive. I have about 20 years of experience. Most recently, I was the head of people at Fringe, and having worked at both multi-billion-dollar global brands and unicorn startups, I developed strategies that really support the well-being of employees, both physically, mentally, and financially. And one of the things that I think is very important, and Katie, you touched upon it, is opportunity. When we think about what employees need in the workplace, a lot of it is more shared than divided. And so when we talk about what's shared, what's important to people, how they're motivated, yes, the modes may be different and we may need to adapt in modern ways, but the core of it is still the same. People want to have purpose, people want to be recognized, people want to be able to contribute to something greater than themselves. So I think this conversation is timely, not just for the minute, but also for the moment in terms of just going into what the world of work will look like in the next 10 to 20 years. So I'm really excited to share some of the highs and lows within my career of experiencing people who were sometimes 40 years my senior, and sometimes I'm the oldest person in the room. And that can sometimes be a little throwing, but what I've really come to appreciate is just knowing that our shared experiences combine us more than they do divide us.
All right, and thank you to all of our panelists. My name is Nicole Johnson, and I'm the Managing Director of Gallagher's National Higher Education Consulting Practice, and I will be your moderator today. My experience with generational diversity really started on my first day with Gallagher back in 2015. When I started, I was fortunate to be placed on a team where I had a manager and a mentor who was 25 years my senior. And he quickly mentored me and really was foundational in my growth and education to learning the business in my first few years here at Gallagher. And then flash forward to today, I am working with Gallagher consultants of all ages from coast to coast. And Katie, I like how you said that you also work with multi-generational clients. I too work with, clients of all ages, and also being able to deliver content to every generation in a way that is best well received is something that we're constantly studying here within Gallagher. So I'm really excited about today's conversation, and I think I'm going to learn a lot from our panelists here. But before we dive in, I want to give you a refresher of why we have this Own Your Growth Women's Leadership series. So really what we like to do here is this series is meant to empower women in the workplace through sharing women's stories and supporting one another's professional development and creating a safe space to have dialogue on these important and timely topics. Over our last webinars, we've covered topics from the power of communication to lessons in resilience to navigating your career trajectory. And this is the most generationally diverse workforce in history. So it's something we all face, whether it is at work with your coworkers or clients, or even in the home with your families. So understanding the challenges and the benefits of collaboration with each other is really what we're trying to accomplish here today. So who are we talking about when we have the different generations in today's workforce? And to set the stage, we want to offer a level set of the different generations of the workplace. And for the purpose of today's presentation, you'll see that we are using our baby boomers as individuals born between 1946 and 1964. We have our Gen X, which is born between 1965 and 1980, millennials 1981 to 1996, and Gen Z 1997 to 2012. And we acknowledge that there are some discrepancies across research and about where millennials end or a Gen Z starts, but for the purpose of today's webinar, we're using 1996. And what you see on the screen here is data from the Department of Labor that showcases where we think the workforce distribution is going to be by the year 2030, which is going to only be in 6 years, which is a short time away. But what we're looking at here is when we have all these different generations represented in our upcoming workforce, each generation has different wants and needs and priorities and communication preferences. So it's really important for us all to understand that. In fact, we did an organizational well-being poll back in May on generational characteristics, and we found that 61% of our survey respondents are using workforce demographic data to drive their overall people strategy. So it is a really pivotal piece in everything that we're doing. All right, so over the course of this presentation, I'm going to be asking a few polls because we want to hear from our audience. And the information that we get from these polls, we are going to aggregate and share as an infographic post-webinar. So our first poll is, which generation do you represent? And you will select the options between, are you a baby boomer born between 1946 and 1964, Gen X born between 1965 and 1980, millennials born between 1981 and 1996, or Gen Z born between 1997 and 2012. And I'll just give you a minute to complete your response. Thank you. So now let's talk about some of the data that comes from each of these different generations that we're talking about today. I think one overarching theme is we're worried about employee engagement for all generations, but there are various concerns that are generation specific. For example, when we shift to our young Gen Z, this is the population that's most difficult to attract. And I personally have seen this. I sit on 2 nonprofit boards, and both nonprofits are focused on student success from high school into college and job placement. And we're really seeing that this next generation of students is not looking for a traditional 9-to-5 desk job. So it's really, there's some industries that are struggling to attract in a traditional work setting. We're also seeing that Gen Z's the population that leaders are struggling to communicate with. So we're struggling to try to get our messages across because maybe email or letters to the home is not reaching the desired method that we had wanted. And when we try to look at other communication methods, only 25% of employers are using generationally relevant communication methods and communicating to a multi-generational audience. When we then move to our millennials, this is the toughest group to retain. And we're also really worried about the return to work. And it's, this is the population that we most commonly see are growing families. And with growing families, we see a change in priorities and responsibilities within the home. But also with millennials, this is the population that leaders are most worried about manager effectiveness. But then once we shift to our Gen X and our baby boomers, this is where our biggest worry is exodus of top talent. So think about your organization and your key leaders and your top talent and the looming potential retirement and exodus of top talent that we're going to be seeing, especially with our baby boomers. But one thing we should lean into is the level of trust that each generation has. One thing that's interesting on this slide here is that Gen Z has the lowest level of high trust in leadership at only 11%. Yet once we shift over to the baby boomers, they have the highest level of trust in leadership at 45%. And so as we shift from Gen Z to baby boomers, you see the low to moderate trust start to increase. And I think, really just over the last few years and with the generations, we've seen a shift in the generations on, who has the power and who do we trust? Do the employees have the power or does the employer? And we also know that leadership can directly impact culture. So we've also done some studies on whose job is it to develop and shape workplace culture. And really, all generations do place a significant on senior leaders, that senior leaders do help drive and shape culture. But for Gen X and baby boomers, they see the greatest impact by HR and senior leaders, while our Gen Z and millennials really focus on the role of the manager. So when we really focus on the role of the manager, we did a study, our generational characteristics poll back in May. We saw that only 13% of our respondents are having current manager training on generational characteristics, and another 30% were considering it. So I think this just goes to show how impactful our managers are on the culture and the role that they play with our employees. So let's dig a bit deeper into the best part of today's discussion, which is hearing from our panelists and hearing their perspectives. And first, we're going to dive deeper into culture and the role that leadership can play in shaping culture that values and leverages generational diversity. So Katie, I'd really like to start with you. When you and I had talked prior, you had mentioned that leaders really are role models. So can you tell us a bit more about this and your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it starts from the top. So if your leaders are not exhibiting the behaviors that you want the rest of your employees to be, others are not going to follow. So I think from a leadership perspective, really making a point of visibly seeking out those diverse opinions. And this can be formally through, engagement surveys and things like that, or focus groups on certain topics, or even just informally, pulling someone aside for a chat to run an idea by them or make sure that something is landing with certain populations. I also think our leaders play a really big role in setting the right expectations and then holding people accountable to them. So when we think of culture, a lot of organizations have a culture statement or a value statement or something like that. If diversity is important to you and your organization, it should be reflected in that value statement. If it's a competency that you expect people to be exhibiting to nurture that culture, again, is it in your competency frameworks and is there a way to weave that in there? And then I think when people aren't meeting those expectations, have those difficult conversations. Be honest and upfront about where you're falling short and what you can do to meet those expectations. I think this also then ties really closely into the point of recognizing people's contributions. Those people who are championing the culture and the behaviors that you want to see, make sure that they know it and that others know it so that others repeat those behaviors. And again, this can be informal, thanks Nicole so much for providing your perspective on this, or it can be formal. One of the things we do at Hatch that I really love is we have leadership awards, and we actually break down the leadership awards based on cohorts, as we call them, or experience levels. So we hand out leadership awards for our newer grads, kind of 0 to 3 years of experience, for our mid-year professionals, 4 to 10, and then our experienced professionals with 11 plus years of experience. And I think it really sets the tone for the contribution of employees at all experience levels, regardless of their backgrounds. And again, I think it really reiterates those performance expectations. And then finally, I would say our leaders are really busy. There is a lot that is put on our leaders today. And so also helping to make some guardrails for them can be really helpful. So for example, we know diversity of thought leads to better outcomes. So, Hatch is a project-based organization. We can think about how can we set particular benchmarks for project teams or team mix when we win new work to make sure that we are getting those diverse perspectives that we want.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, Katie. In my experience, I usually use a 3-prong approach, or at least that's what I've seen in organizations to be highly successful. First has to start with you. I want to say that I am very proud to represent the fact that I am an elder millennial. So I grew up at a time where social media meant two very different things. You were social when you were in person, and media was your VCR. And so to move from that era into an era where, in an instant, your stock price can be affected by a reputational risk because of the way you treated an employee, I think that's something everyone has to be accountable for. So if you are a leader in your organization today, be the change you want to see. I remember what it was like to be the youngest person in my group and just try to fake along, knowing a certain song or a certain group or a certain movie, because I didn't want to feel like I was strange or the odd person out. And so you've now probably moved into that space where you're the ones leading those conversations, right? Those 5 minutes in between meetings or during your offsites where you're just talking about different things. Find ways to bring people together. One example from an individual perspective for me has been Batman, right? I told one of my coworkers, hey, if you have any trouble, send up the bat signal. And they were like, I don't know what that is. And in that moment, I could have said, how could you not know? This is like a cultural milestone. You need to know that, right? But I'm like, hey, guess what? Your Batman's probably like Robert Pattinson. My Batman is Michael Keaton. And let's compare notes. So just finding fun ways or very interesting ways to make sure that, hey, we have a shared experience, or we could. And I would love to invite you into that world. That way can really help set the tone for others as well. The second prong would be about having that at a peer leader level, right? Holding your other peers accountable. Ask them, seek out from them. What's happening on their teams when they're having interns come through and come onto their teams? Are there successful ways that they're integrating those people? How can you create cohorts if that's not already an established process within your organization? Some organizations are mature enough where you have a career path, you go from analyst to associate to senior to VP, it's clear. But some organizations, you know what? It really depends on what you're doing. You may be a lifelong person who does this one job for 40 years. I've been with those organizations. How can we make sure those people are visible, that we're honoring their ability of loyalty, of really becoming specialized, right? Those things can become lost when we are just talking about progress and trajectory. So what are you doing to make sure you're bringing in all those other spaces within your organization? And then lastly, Katie, again, I'm going to have to springboard off of you, where it's your mission statement. Can you widen the lens? Maybe not necessarily change that language, because I'm sure a lot of thought went into it, but how does that apply to our team? How does it apply to the people that we're offboarding, the entire employee journey, as we have knowledge transfers going out the door and losing institutional knowledge? How are we capturing that? How are we making sure that our alumni, whether that be through retirement or just exiting, because as you said, millennials are very hard to retain. How can we make sure that people can see what they've contributed and know that no matter where you are in your career, you can add value? Those would be my 3 points.
And I'll jump in with just a very small ad. Both Katie and Cassandra have done a great job in really kind of framing this up, but and I'll touch on what Cassandra said, making it a little bit fun. We're going through a bit of a cultural transformation as it relates to generational diversity. And what we've decided to try, again, in the spirit of making it fun, but also bringing that awareness, is we're bringing in a generational speaker, one that really brings insight to the differences between the generations. Because some of what happens, at least in our culture, is there are these preconceived notions about what that generation is all about, what they're good at, what they're not good at, why they can be leaders, why they can't be leaders. And it creates this bias around a generation that really affects their ability to grow their careers within your organization, or the feeling of acceptance within the organization. So we're actually bringing in a generational speaker that will be talking truthfully and candidly about what the generations are about, generally speaking, what has formed them, bringing awareness to the reality is, as parents, you created the generation you talk about, which is often funny to hear, and also bringing awareness to the reality. It's people like Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, keep going. I mean, these folks started what is become known to be multi-billions of dollars of wealth in their 20s. And so just removing that barrier, if they're not old enough, they're from a generation, they don't understand work ethic, in a fun way, is something you may also try to help really shift that culture. People have to understand it, see it, feel it, touch it, and personally relate to it. Because culture is a difficult thing to change if there's not true individual acceptance of why that change is. It's based on behaviors.
Thank you. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, Marucci. I think what's really interesting is going back to how leaders can develop mentorship programs that cater to multi-generational workforce. A small percentage of employers are actually doing this type of training. So what would you recommend when it comes to having different generations mentor each other?
Yeah, it's one of the funny things. I think most of us as HR professionals would tell you mentorship programs are just not easy. I mean, I think every one of us has probably tried them, developed and built and created multiple versions of them, some of which have kind of sort of worked, others which really have not, but they can work. And I think that's the most important thing, is just remember they can work. But when it comes to generational diversity, if you look at the previous, or even in many regards, the current model of mentorship, you have a mentor and you have a mentee. So you have someone who has all of this knowledge and experience, this wealth of information, and they are going to mentor someone. In other words, teach, train, develop, and grow them. And the mentee is there as a sponge to suck it up, to absorb, to ask questions, and to learn. And that model, where it's worked well, it still works well today. The hardest part is creating the pairing, the mentor and the mentee that actually trust each other and are willing to truly engage in this relationship that's, psychologically safe, where they could learn. Now we're going to add a layer of how do you use that type of format to put someone together that maybe is 21 with maybe someone who's 55, where their worlds could not be more opposite. I mean, what they think of every day, how they communicate, their foundations have just come from very different places. And what I would tell you is, I think the new model, and there's lots of research out there on this, MentorLoop is one site you can go get some information from. There's plenty of other consultants out there, but the new model is, it shouldn't be this one person, the mentor, going and sharing and downloading and just teaching and training another individual, a younger, newer worker, or someone that's progressing. But instead, why don't we take each individual that's wanting to learn and grow, or potentially needs to learn and grow, understand what their interests are, what their skills are, what their career goals are, and pair people now that can cross mentor. You've got two mentors versus a mentor and a mentee. Now you're 21-year-old, and I happen to have a 21-year-old son, who my son teaches me things today that I didn't know. He's interning, and he is coming home and sharing things he's learning in his internship from a tech perspective. The kid can show me a lot, even though I consider myself to be tech savvy. But the truth and the reality is, there are things multi-generations can teach to each other. And if you find the right way to pair people together and you create relationships, not only do you benefit in the work product, because it's proven just diverse companies are far more profitable, but generationally diverse organizations clearly benefit in so many different ways, because you're truly creating an all-in culture where everyone is comfortable speaking up. You create this intimate relationship with others, and in different generational gap, you have a greater appreciation for the differences and why they think the way they do. And so I truly believe the model of the future is you have two mentors paired together versus the mentor and the mentee. And it's incredibly important for us to think differently as it relates to those relationships.
Yeah, Marucci, I could not agree with you more. And I would actually go a little bit further and say that I have thrived most when I've been part of a cohort, right? Where it cuts across multiple things. I've been parts of cohorts for new hire orientation, where I'm starting the same day as potentially a C-suite leader. And because we're starting the same day, we get to go to the same orientation things, where 20 years ago, that was pretty much cutting edge. No matter how junior you were, you probably were not getting anywhere near to that C-suite. And so I think you highlight very important things, Marucci. When you just have two people, there's a lot of other factors that can come in as to why they either succeed together or don't. And so when you're allowing more people into that conversation and then creating parameters, I think that's why employee resource groups, sometimes known as business resource groups, can also thrive, because you're taking one shared identity, one shared value, and saying everyone can come into this conversation, everyone can contribute. And you're allowing people from different ages, from different genders, from different walks of life to come together around this shared thing. So I think about your mentorship programs and say, hey, yes, maybe there are some specific areas where a one-by-one relationship makes the most sense, but how can we get more ROI by including more people, whether that's 4 people, 6 people, 12 people, and allowing so many people to learn from each other. And then bonus points if you can make sure there's generational diversity within those groups where people can thrive and again get to feel more comfortable and included in the conversations from the top of the house all the way to the most junior person.
I think that's a great point, Cassandra. We have something here we call mentor circles, which is similar. It's a group format, so you're getting different perspectives, which I think is really helpful for employees. And Marucci, I loved one of the things you said about sort of personalizing the mentorship experience, right? It's not about just pairing people from different backgrounds or in different roles, but it's about really catering to that individual specific needs that they have. And I think if I can draw some parallels also with training, that's, it sounds very obvious, but a lot of times when training is designed, we don't actually speak to the target audience to understand what they need and what their requirements are, which sounds so incredibly obvious, but often gets missed, sadly. So I think making sure that we're speaking to target audiences across all generations. And one of the ways that we've done this really successfully is we speak both to the target audience as well as to their direct manager. And so we're able to really get that broad perspective of what the requirements are, make sure everyone's on the same page, and then build the program accordingly. So we know that we're supporting the target audience with what they need, but then also their leaders feel like they are learning the right behaviors to be successful. In some of our training programs, we're also using something that we've called accountability partners. So essentially pairing someone up with someone else in their cohort and intentionally trying to do those pairings to be very mixed. So having a newer leader potentially paired with one of our experienced leaders where they get to learn from each other and have very different perspectives and reactions to some of the material that they're learning. For a new people leader, it might be their first time ever having to give someone really difficult feedback, whereas a more experienced leader has all the tips and tricks and lessons learned throughout their career. So that's something that's really worked well for us as well here.
And Katie, I really like that topic of training. And I think that allows us to open the door and talk about training in a different way, which really leads to a large topic of conversation of succession planning. Like I said, we have a large portion of our population at baby boomers, and it's a lot of our key talent. So what are key considerations for developing training and succession planning that accommodate the distinct needs of the various generations within today's workforce?
Yeah, and the question there around the Gen Z training around expectations in particular sticks out to me. I'm a firm believer in being honest and upfront about expectations. And if you communicate those expectations upfront, then obviously people have a better chance of meeting them. So something I've seen done is, an expectations management program of sorts where you have your newer grads or new hires kind of come in. It can go over some of the basics like dress code, how we expect people to communicate with clients, things like in-office presence or remote work, and just set sort of that baseline that works really well. I've also seen where they have new hires at certain levels, typically more entry-level positions, go through a bit of a boot camp. It might be the first week, it might be a little bit longer, but a bit of a professional skills boot camp of sorts to really help familiarize them with the specific ways of working of that organization's, the quality of work that is expected in that organization, give them the opportunity to practice in a safe space and get feedback before, they're sort of fed to the wolves, so to speak, with clients. So I think that's been really effective in making sure that everyone is on the same page about those expectations and ensuring that no one is operating under assumptions that then can set us up for failure if people are on different pages. I'm also a really big proponent for assigning buddies during the onboarding process. And I think this can be a great way to transfer knowledge with those new hires. And it also gives them a really safe space where they can clarify some of those expectations or check in on some things that, maybe aren't quite as obvious, but they want to make sure that they're meeting those expectations. So those are kind of a few things that stick out to me.
Yeah, very good points. And I think the plan is the most important. And certainly Katie's spoken to that. I would challenge every HR professional and every leader in any organization to really go graph your org. Understand where you sit today. When we saw a minute ago the generational diversity within the organization expected in 2030, it's an interesting graph. Go compare your organization to that graph. Some organizations, when they go through that exercise, are going to realize they are very Gen X and baby boomer heavy. And then you have to stop and ask yourself, are you getting the right pipeline today to prepare for the future? Do you have the right relationships with universities and other institutions to be able to bring in pipeline today? Do you have a culture in which those individuals are going to want to work there? Which was a question we asked earlier. How do you create a culture that's certainly conducive to this generational diversity? But when you have that picture, the graph, go use your data, your analytics, go get predictive if you have it. But now you can step back and you can ask yourself, where do you go from here? And a lot of that was that training readiness. I mean, do you have people that you're stretching fast to be able to get them to a point where 5 years, 10 years down the road, you're going to need them to take on much bigger roles? We're experiencing with these generations far more turnover. They're not staying with organizations for life. And so I do think you need to start thinking about, is the method in which you're onboarding, is the method in which you're training conducive to bringing people on more quickly and allowing them greater responsibility in a shorter period of time? Because we come from a historical culture with your baby boomers and your Gen Xers where you just learn over time. You'll get there eventually. And I just don't think we're going to be able to do that in the future. And so you think about the TikTok videos, you think about YouTube. My eldest son, who has learned nothing about car repair from his dad or I, goes and YouTubes or TikToks how to fix something. And by the way, he fixes it. Like, I don't know how he does this. Miraculously, it's fixed. We need to start thinking about that from a succession and development training perspective for our talent based on what we forecast or predict our organizations to be. So there's a lot there. And Katie, you're spot on. We've got to have these plans.
What I love about Katie and Marucci's advice is it's actionable. I'm taking notes. And I'm a panelist, so I hope the audience is taking notes as well. And Marucci, you almost stole my thunder. I was going to say, we have to think about how is work done, right? A lot of times there's this aversion to putting in new systems in place and new processes in place. And we have to shift people's mindset from gatekeeping by me having this information and just dripping it out to other people. I'm creating a safe area for my job, right? That keeps me employed, to knowledge transfer. I want people to have this information. The more people in this organization that have access to the information allows us to be able to move faster, right? And be more successful together. So I think even just taking a pulse check of where your people are, right? Is that something that they know that if I'm able to provide this information to other people in the organizations, I still have a place, I still have value. I think that's really important. That will secure any training or succession plan you have. And then second, how am I going to disperse this information? The beauty of working at companies that were at least 100 years old, had at least 100,000 employees, is that we had systems. Whether you like them or not, they were there. And at times I would feel like, oh, I feel so restrained. I wish we could be more innovative. And then I went into startup land where everything was kind of made up at the same time. And you're like, oh, now I understand why people have processes. So we all know what we're doing, right? But that bifurcation allowed me to realize that if you're not using technology, technology will use you. There is no more space for us to avoid that. So what are things you can record? How can people record? How can people share information asynchronously? Because now you might have a coworker in Japan. You might have a language barrier. You might have a gender gap. You might have a generational gap, right? And so I think it's really important, even if you're an HR person, team of one, you can do this of thinking, like Marucci said, graphing where your organization is. Do you need more junior talent and early talent in? Do you actually need more leadership? figuring out what Katie said. How do we actually set expectations that are transparent throughout the organization? So one team is not thriving while the other team is not, and we're wondering why there's a gap, and we're just leaving it to the leaders to decide. And then lastly, how can we leverage technology? By 2030, there are just certain jobs that will not exist. How can we rescope, rethink, and remain agile no matter where you are in your career?
I love that that comment you made on the knowledge dripping. I often call it knowledge hoarding, where you have individuals who have all these skill sets, have all these knowledge, and that's kind of their bread and butter. So there's a real fear to share that with other people and to become redundant. So it's about recognizing the contributions of those people while also supporting others. And I think there's a common misconception that succession planning is about replacing someone. And yes, that is part of succession planning, is thinking about sustainment of the organization, but it's also about developing other people and making sure that they're having meaningful careers. And so one of the exercises we're going through right now is a knowledge transfer exercise. So thinking through, how are we going to catalog and actually transfer knowledge across different generations in the organization? And we're thinking of it both in terms of I'll call it the tangibles and the intangibles. The tangibles being, those areas of subject matter expertise, client relationships, things like that you have to make sure pass on. But then there's also the intangibles, like the role that person plays in your culture or leading that team, and making sure that those things also don't get lost when that person is no longer in the team or no longer in the organization. The other thing I would say to everyone listening is, stay calm and don't panic. Succession planning can be really, really daunting, particularly if you're in a larger organization. When you think about the sheer number of people and roles that you need to be thinking about, it's overwhelming. So, stay calm and prioritize. Think about what are the biggest needs. Think about, the next 6 to 12 months and what's going to be right in front of you. Get some traction, get some buy-in from your leaders, and then take it from there. Don't try to get everything done at once. Try to prioritize and then ease your way into it, because otherwise it is very daunting. And frankly, you probably won't be able to get the traction that you want to get if you try to do it all at once.
Yeah, these are all fantastic ideas, and you've sparked some ideas for me. And I thought about going back to the beginning of the presentation where I said that Gen Z was the most difficult to attract and millennials are the most difficult to retain, and how critical career development pathways can be. So for Gen Z and millennials, these are the generations that really want to see career growth and see career opportunities, and are almost turned away from careers that seem stagnant. So if you are an organization that is, has succession planning, but also just showing wherever you are in your career within our organization, the opportunity, the developments, the training, and just the pathways, it's going to really help from an attraction and retention standpoint. And it kind of brings it all back together that we're also then helping and supporting the succession plan while we're at it. Okay, so on that topic, we want to hear from you all and get your perspective on how leaders can develop and implement training programs to support a multi-generational workforce. So we have another poll, and we're going to ask you what type of training or development programs would be most beneficial for a multi-generational workforce. And you can choose between tailored career stage training, multi-generational skills training, inclusive leadership programs, reciprocal mentorship, and diversity-driven innovation workshops. So you can select as many as you seem fit. And we'll give you a few more seconds here to complete that poll. All right, thank you. So this next topic I'd like to talk about is communicating and collaboration. So for you on the phone, think about your preferred method of communication between your coworkers. Is it Teams and instant messaging? Is it walking to somebody's desk? Is it picking up the phone? Is it sending an email? we all have different communication styles. And for me personally, I tend to change my communication style based on the generation or the individual that I'm trying to communicate to. I know the people that want me to walk to their desk or leave them a voicemail or send a text or a Teams. And we recently saw that there was a LinkedIn study that indicated that about 40% of employees over the age of 55 have not directly spoken to a Gen Z employee in the last year. And 25% of Gen Zs have not spoken to someone over the age of 50 in the last year. So there's significant gaps there. And then imagine trying to approach somebody in the workplace that you do not commonly speak to. So Cassandra, I want to come to you for this question. If we keep in mind what strategies have proven effective in fostering collaboration among different generations, what would you recommend to today's audience?
Yeah, I love the stat that you bring up, and I hope it's jaw-dropping to a lot of people, because when you think about it, the pandemic also further isolated us when it comes to communications. For most of us, we had to, if we were able to, had to go remote. And so being able to send someone a quick message or leave someone a quick voicemail became the mode that was sometimes the only option available to us. And now with a lot of hybrid, return to office, we're going back into workspaces where for some people, especially within the Gen Z community, this is their first time ever having to enter a physical workspace. For some of these people, they graduated from high school virtually, right? They went through college virtually. And so now I'm expected to show up in an office space and just know how to interact with someone who's more senior than me, not just in age, but even in terms of tenure. And I think what we have to remember is when it comes to collaboration, we all have to be agile. The way that I collaborate with even my spouse, depending on the day, is different. And we can all share in that. And so give ourselves a little bit of grace, because globally, we all just shared an experience that is unlike anything we've ever experienced, and not attribute it necessarily just to generational difference. So I would say start there. I always invite people to be curious about intersectionality. And what I mean by that, it's very easy to just be like, oh, this person looks over 50, under 30. I'm not even going to attempt. So collaboration tactic number one for everyone who's taking notes would be bold. I'm a big believer it has to start with you. If you're that 55-year-old person, guess what? You have more experience in the workplace. You should be reaching out because you are accustomed to having that exposure and experience in that environment. So start the conversation. Step number two, if you're a leader, if you have a team, what are methods that are successful within your teams and how can you double down on that? If it's calling up a call, right? I've seen email threads. And so I tell my team, if it takes more than 3 emails, it has to be live, because it's very easy to hide behind something. And that's when a lot of the communication can start to dissolve, because we don't truly understand the intention of the person, or honestly, a 30-second conversation takes three times that amount of time to transcribe. So if it's more than 3 emails, that deserves a call. That could be virtually, you can set it up. I leave that choice to you. And then organizationally, again, how are you leveraging technology? If the only way that you know how to meet is to have meetings from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and that's when your people get to work, I'm pretty sure burnout is more of a reason you're experiencing frazzled communications than any generational gap that may present itself. So even think about your organization. Are we allowing opportunities for organic conversation to take place? And if not, what are some of the barriers we can remove to ensure that people have the opportunities to create those relationships?
I love your comment around being bold, Cassandra. And I think also leading with empathy, right? We don't always have the best self-awareness. We assume that people's preferences is the same as ours. How we like to be communicated and collaborated with may be very, very different for someone else. And so I think having that gut check and challenging ourselves and having those courageous conversations with employees to really understand, is this working? Is there something we should be doing differently? What are your preferences and how can I meet you halfway so that we can work more effectively together? I think the other thing that comes to mind it takes intentionality. Things may happen organically, and that would be wonderful, but it also takes intentionality to make sure it's happening as much as we want, when we want, how we want. And so we really need to make sure that we have those mechanisms in place to help facilitate some of this. And so I mentioned earlier, Hatch being a project-based organization. So again, one way you can do that is having benchmarks for team mix and how you incorporate different generations or different groups into a team mix for a particular project to make sure you're getting those diverse perspectives. The other thing that I really love is psychometric assessments. So not only can that help you build out your own self-awareness and understand better how you like to work and be collaborated with, you can also share that information with your peers and have really meaningful conversations about how to work more effectively together. There's even some assessments, one that we use here, SDI, Strengths Deployment Inventory. It has Teams and Outlook plugins. So if I go to email Cassandra, it'll actually pop up on the side. This is Cassandra's assessment results and how she likes emails. She likes a lot of detail. She likes an agenda ahead of time. She likes a call to action, or, she prefers informal communication. So there's also tools that are out there that can help to facilitate better collaboration in organizations that I would really encourage people to investigate and to use.
Katie, I love the introduction of the psychometric assessment because I think there's so many different fun ways to use those tools that provide incredible self-awareness and the team building. And I think for whatever environmental circumstances have existed during each generation, they have their preferred and perceived right style going to misconceptions. So it's my right style. I had one of my colleagues come down to my office because two of our leaders are going back and forth, and there's like an email string that's probably as long as my ceiling to the floor, and they can't get resolution. And my colleague's like, what is wrong with these people? Do they not know how to have a face-to-face conversation? Like, hello, what happened to connection and collaboration? And I think it goes back to there is a misconception sometimes that their preferred style isn't necessarily working. And sometimes it's not. Let's face it. When you have an email string that's ceiling to floor and you haven't figured it out, it's not working. But you also have to understand there are preferred styles. And so how do you help people understand how to get out of their comfort zone and communicate differently? And one of the things that we do that I think works relatively effectively, and sadly, a lot of organizations have taken the budget out over time, we still invest in connection points. So we still provide budget for teams to go have cross-functional engagements. We do cross-campus type celebration days. So for the summer, we have 3 events. We bring people together. They interact with others that they might work with frequently and infrequently, and it builds relationships to understand the people a little bit better. We also do some of the psychometric assessments where we do help people that are going to be working together understand what drives the other one, so that while they're collaborating and while they're working on a common purpose forward, they know and agree to some foundational principles and how they're going to be more effective together. And I think that's really important. But I don't want to underestimate the importance. Everything that was stated by both Cassandra and Katie are very, very valuable. I think the relationship side needs to be invested in. I think individually, when you know someone more personally, you'll collaborate better and you'll forgive some of what you might perceive to be not the best method, and you'll be more accepting of trying new things.
Thank you, Marucci. And as you said, relationships and collaboration is critical, but sometimes, it also can be a challenge. And so leading into why do we think that, we're going to do one more poll here on what do you believe is the most significant barrier to fostering collaboration across different generations in the workplace? And you can select one from what you see on the screen here. Is it A, communication differences, varied preferences for communication channels and styles? Is it technology gaps with differences in technology preferences or even access? Is it C, cultural and generational biases, or preconceived notions or stereotypes about other generations? Or do you think it's D, the lack of leadership support, whether it's insufficient encouragement or just actual support from leadership? And now I'm going to raise another question to the panel. Marucci, I saw a study by McKinsey & Company that suggested that companies with the most diversity outperform those with the least diversity by 36% in profitability. And I think you also touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation. So it also suggests that diversity impacts directly our bottom line. So in what ways do you think, or have you seen, that generational diversity enhances innovation and problem solving within organizations?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with just level setting us all on innovation, because it seems to be the big buzzword, whether it's innovation or transformation. And I just wrote down a definition for the discussion, just so we can all kind of wrap our heads around this. It's the ability to conceive, develop, and scale new products, services, or processes and business models for customers. It's essentially doing something that creates value. And so when we really process and think about that, it can be big, it can be small, it's just a new way forward. If we think about that, the audience that we are, whatever business you're in, the audience or the customer base that you are really after it's diverse in and of itself. And so if you're going to go sit in a room with a bunch of baby boomers or a bunch of Gen Xers or millennials or Gen Zs and create something in a silo, you're not going to meet the audience. You're not going to create something that's going to meet the broader need. And so I will tell you, we've done a lot of work in this space here at the airport. We're obviously an international airport. We service people of all ages, all demographics, you name it. And what we found was, by bringing together a very diverse group of people, we are more able to deliver solutions that actually are impactful and lasting. The other beautiful thing is we're creating a mindset where just because we create it today doesn't mean it's what we need to do tomorrow. It's this continuous response of change. And so I personally believe that generational diversity today is so important because the foundation of what each individual expects or is looking for varies quite significantly in the workplace, as well as the customer base. I would encourage every organization to go on and think of how do they bring together a diverse group of people to talk about new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of creating, where everyone at the table has a voice. And that is not always easy. Sometimes we find that the early generation sitting at the table is just listening and absorbing, and they might be a little concerned to raise their voice. Or if they do, someone in the room might say, yeah, that's good, but you don't really understand the bigger picture. You're too early in your career. And so just making sure that in that space of generational diversity, when it comes to innovation, you set those ground rules. Every voice matters, every opinion will be considered, everything will be explored, and really create an environment where people are willing to come in and come together. Because I will tell you, we've seen it firsthand, when we bring these groups together that are truly diverse, the solutions that we're able to implement are far greater than when a team went off and created their own solutions. It's unparalleled, that they're completely different. So I would say definitely encourage cross-functional, cross-diverse teams.
Yeah, Marucci, I love everything you said. And it actually brings me to why I went to work at Fringe in the first place. Fringe is a benefits platform that is disrupting how you offer benefits by offering lifestyle benefits that can touch everyone. And that's what it comes back to, the core of humanity. So even if you have a product that you think only attracts or is only sold to an audience of 55-year-olds and above, guess what? It's probably their millennial or Gen Z kids that are buying that product for them online that are supplying that. So everything that you're putting out into the marketplace should be a reflection of the ideas that are coming in from your own organization. And if you're not leveraging that, It's almost as though hiring consultants and then not paying attention to them, right? You have the talent in-house, leverage them. They want to be heard, but they have to be invited to the conversation, not once, not twice, but again and again. So leverage the people inside to make sure that you're meeting the marketplace outside.
I love that. And there are a lot of employers that aren't necessarily doing that. So I think it's a fantastic recommendation. And we're going to close here with one more poll and then a closing slide. So I want to ask the audience, in your experience, which approach do you believe would be the most effective in leveraging generational diversity to enhance innovation and problem solving within your organization? Is it, you're going to select one, so is it DEI training, focusing on generational diversity, open conversation, having forums for sharing generational perspectives? Is it inclusive policies, promoting age diversity in leadership roles, mixed age collaboration, establishing those diverse project teams, as Katie mentioned, or continuous learning, resources for ongoing education and generational dynamics? All right, and with that, let's end our discussion by asking each of our panelists what they hope the audience walks away with today. If we acknowledge the awareness, if we acknowledge that awareness brings change and that this was a discussion full of that, what can an audience member do today to address generational diversity in the workplace? And Marucci, we'll start with you.
Yeah, very simply, I would say invest the time now. You heard a lot today. There's so much more that can be talked about. A great privilege to be here with Cassandra and Katie, very, very smart, bright ladies in this space. But every one of you on this phone need to own this too, and you probably do, which is why you're here. I think being planful, being intentional, being data-driven is really going to be what drives getting results in this space. It's been said during recessionary periods. It's true during this pivotal transition in our world today with so many generations in the workforce together. Those who figure this out will be the ones that are more successful than those that don't. It is that simple. And so there is a burning platform for us all to help our organizations understand how to bring these generations together. And quite frankly, as a sidebar, personally, we've got to figure this out too. And so it'll help us, it'll help all of our employees just be better people overall.
Awesome. Yeah, I would say in reflecting on today's conversation, which I loved, thank you so much for having me, and Marucci and Cassandra, thank you so much for the conversation. Kind of the three final thoughts that I would leave everyone with is lead with empathy, seek to understand how others are feeling and really meet them where they're at. Prioritize and be intentional in creating those opportunities that you want to enact the change you want to see. You won't be able to do everything. Think about what's most important and start there and get some traction. And then finally, it starts with you. It starts with all of us. So seek feedback. We all have our own biases and our own, backgrounds and experiences that we bring with us to the workplace. So start with that desire to understand and really gut check yourself and make sure that you aren't operating on your own biases. So feedback is a gift. I know that's cheesy, but really do go out there and seek some feedback and make sure that you're creating the opportunities that you want to create.
Yeah, and just to wrap it all up, I would say what Marucci and Katie said, do everything they said as fast as you can. But honestly, awareness does bring the change. You may have more resources than you think available in your organization as it is today. But if you don't know what that is, you're going to do a lot of starts and stops, and it's going to feel like there's no way to accomplish this really huge task. So I say, go back to basics. What do you have? Do you have a lot of senior leaders that could be contributing more? Start with them. Do you have a lot of young talent that really needs more development? Figure out the cohorts. Whatever is in most abundance, start there and let that be your first domino in the change.
Thank you so much to our panelists. And we're going to close by asking for feedback from the audience here today. As we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the topics that we cover are chosen by audience interest. And if we think about 2025 and the changes we face now or in the future, we want to create a supportive environment. So given that we have a list of topics that we're going to ask you here, and want to give you an opportunity to respond. So if you could select the ones that you're interested in, there is no limit. Which of these topics would you like to see come to fruition in 2025? So for the leadership topics that we have for next year, it could be leadership skills and executive presence. Are we burned out of the topic burnout? Negotiation skills, preventing rust out, as in disengagement, lack of interest, resilient and emotional intelligence, adapting to change in the workplace, enhancing digital literacy and tech skills, legal and ethical considerations in HR, and lastly, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. So please take a moment and select any of the topics that you are interested in, and we'll touch on these in the next year. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I know I gained a lot from today, and I hope you did too. We hold these webinars 3 times a year, and this is the last one for 2024. But don't fret, 2025 is already on the calendar. So there should be a widget on your On24 console that will take you to the registration page for our March 5th of 2025 webinar in celebration of International Women's Day. And with that, thank you to our panelists, and thank you everybody for attending.